All right, well, thank you everybody for coming. I get mixed reports that traffic going north is a little slow tonight, so we might get some people that are trickling in. So experience that. I don't really have a whole lot to say about this talk. I'm just interested in seeing how it unveils, as you probably are. I'll introduce Kevin. And here's the name of his talk, all technology we bring to the equation tonight. So thanks again for coming. Stick around at the end for the drawing for the door prize, and enjoy. Okay, Klinemeier.
Hi, I'm Kevin Klinemeier, and a little bit about me, and then we'll get into the talk. Up until just recently, I worked as a software consultant, before that software architect, and lead teams, and as a consultant I help teams become more effective at writing software, which a lot of times in agile transformations, which was my gig until recently, it was how do we do a better job of testing so that we know what's wrong sooner and can respond to it. And that's going to be a lot of the theme of this talk. Super excited in the sidelines to talk to you about the company I joined, ZCrowd, who are using high-skill crowdsourcing to change the way work works. We're going to change the whole world. That's not my talk, but I'd love to talk about that too later if you want to hit me up. So low-tech acceptance test-driven development. Who's doing or has some attempt at doing acceptance test-driven development today? Anybody? A handful of folks? All right. And why do I say low-tech? And it's because as I research this topic and try to communicate it to people, the technology ends up taking the front seat. What are some ATD technologies that you guys know? Cucumber. What else? We have Fitness out there from Ward Cunningham, our benevolent wiki benefactor, and some of those kind of technologies. And it seemed to me, as people are talking about how to do ATD, it focused on how do I use Cucumber or SpecFlow or RSpec on Ruby and those kinds of things. That's entirely missing the point. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. Two things I want you to know about me in addition. Number one, I'm not actually a Luddite. So I have a smartphone and I write software for a living. We're just having fun. And the other one is I'm not an artist. So these are cool. All right. So ATD, if you're not one of the folks who raised your hand, ATD is acceptance test driven development. I'm going to take these apart, but first I want to make sure that we understand what an acceptance test is about, and then we'll get into the details of it. So one of the great things about the English language is that you can say the same thing in different ways and different things in the same way, which makes it fantastic for poetry, but kind of bad for programming. Here, when I talk about acceptance tests, what I'm looking forward to is an experience you're going to have with a decision maker in your organization who's going to decide whether they accept the work that your team has done. If you're in the Scrum model, that might be your product owner at the end of a sprint. If you're on the Kanban model, that's some other decision maker, may still call them a product owner at the end of your cycle, but they're going to decide whether you did it or not, or whatever it was. And of course, that's the nebulous part that we're all here to hear about. The unfortunate overlap in this term is with user acceptance testing. So they're totally, completely different concepts with almost no relation, despite 2/3 of the words being the same. That's a totally other concept. And just to make sure that, to make that super clear, user acceptance testing is usually going to the actual users of the system who are not usually the decision makers and asking them what they think. That's super valuable, but it's not what we're talking about today. We'll get into what driving development looks like. But first I want to talk to you, one slide at a time, about some philosophy. Aristotle, in his work, Rhetoric, of which I have a lot of familiarity with the Wikipedia page, but apparently he says that in order to persuade anyone to do anything, you first have to persuade them that there is a problem to be solved. So let's talk about what the problem is, and if we can all agree that we're solving the same problem, then and only then can we usefully move on to what a solution might be, and that's what I want to talk about here. Why do we want to do anything differently, ATD or anything else? So what I've graphed here, who's seen this before? Is this familiar? Some folks? All right. So, yeah. What I've graphed here is there's two axes, and on this axis is time, and that's time since some problem was introduced. That's what happened at time 0. And that's what we have developers for, is to create problems, right? That's what they apparently do every day. They've written some bug or something that the product owner wouldn't be satisfied with. And so as time goes on, this other axis is cost. That's cost to fix, which is usually in-person time. And we understand that as time goes on, the cost increases. So somewhere down here, maybe in a development cycle, this could be in a final QA if you went it that way. Production is probably over here someplace, up on the roof, those kinds of things. If we think a little bit about why it increases, I think there's a few reasons, but just talk about which of these are going to be true for your team. The number one is just humans. If you ask your programmer teammates about to fix some problem that they created this morning, and the answer is more likely to be, okay, yeah, I can fix that, no problem. If you ask them about something that they wrote last sprint or last month, you get this response like they're Gandalf in the Mines of Moria. I have no memory of this code. I'm not able to change it. You get answers that are like, what idiot wrote this and what liar put my name on it? The other problem that happens as time goes on is we keep building software. We build things on top of what was built. And now you want to change something that we wrote a long time ago and have written a lot of stuff on top of. Who loves regression testing the most? Right? Ouch. That's big. Yeah, it's great. And so another way to sum that up is that software that exists is harder to change than software that does not exist. So if we can move this feedback cycle down and find out that we don't like it, then whatever we do to accomplish that is going to deliver benefits to our team. The other thing that I want to prep you with is this isn't free. So I think it's worth it, but it's not free. As you talk to your teammates, you're going to propose to do something, maybe the thing I talk about here. We should start doing this activity, and people are going to say, we don't have time to do that. And the idea here that I'm illustrating with this green part is that while moving from some hypothetical point here, maybe this is 4 hours and this is 2 hours of time, because we found out sooner, it's easier to implement and it doesn't take us as long and there's not as much stuff to retest. It may have a cost associated with it of an hour. And that's an hour doing the rest of the stuff this talk is about, talking to each other, planning things, going through hypotheticals. That doesn't mean it's not worth it. It means it's still a benefit. So would you pay $1 to earn $2? Yeah, that looks good. And this is a good way to have that conversation of what are we looking to understand the benefits are going to be. And we're going to invest some time for what kind of payoff. One thing I didn't mention at the start that I want to encourage is medium quality questions all the way through. So if you have low quality questions, don't ask those. But medium quality questions, I'll answer right away. If you have a super high quality question, I may say, that's a great question. I'm going to write it down and we'll answer it at the end of the presentation. But if you have questions or especially clarifications, ask them as we go. All right, so we want to improve this feedback cycle. Which leads us to this question. What did you say acceptance tests were again? There's something to do with the product owner. And an example that I have here, let me undo one of my animations on the next slide. I'm going to peek at it here. Oh good, it came off. All right. Who knows this format? What's the name of this thing?
It's user story.
Yeah, these are user stories. It's not ATD, but it plugs into this idea. But we get some pieces of information here as some role, I want to take some action so that I presumably get some value. And that's not the whole story. So we have this big question, what else do I need to know? What else needs to be true about this system or this thing that I'm building? Here's my example. Here's first animation in this deck. Are you ready? All right. So as a teacher, I want to share slides online so I don't have to email them. All right. What else do I need to test? What are the other questions? Real questions for you guys. What are the other tests we need for this?
Share them to whom?
Yeah. To whom?
Over what?
Over what?
Do you care if other people can see the slides? Security, I guess?
How big are these things?
Yeah, file size. These questions, which are good questions from experts like yourselves, are the beginnings of acceptance test-driven development. And usually they're described as acceptance criteria. They're not a test yet. We've got work to do before they're a test. But these are the criteria. And the sense of the questions that you are asking here is, when I show you this at the end, it's almost like that is the final exam worth 100% of your grade. So if you take a course like that, there's one exam, it's at the end, and whatever you get on that exam is your grade. That's a lot like your final demo in the Scrum model. Then what's the question you ask every day you go to class? And the instructor's lecturing, you ask?
Is this going to be on the exam?
That's right. And if it's not on the exam, what do you do with that information? That's in college. That's called unprofessional collegiate behavior. Here it's called effectiveness. If you don't care about it, I don't want to build it for you. And we're beginning that conversation right here. And the reason it's called acceptance criteria is we're really asking, what are the criteria you're going to use at the end when I ask you whether you accept this or not? So that's the beginnings of that.
Could you rephrase that as what is the minimum criteria?
Yeah, I think that'd be valuable.
Because you could add extra stuff that impresses them and they like it, but it wasn't part of the criteria.
Mm-hmm. And that could lead into a conversation about, do you want to do that now instead of the rest of the stuff we've planned? Or would you like to do that later with preference towards probably later, and there's other stuff to get done?
But really, all of these criteria, shouldn't they really be separate user stories?
They could be, if you can divide the work that way. So what we see here is the beginning of this conversation that has to have between the testing organization, or the testing part of the team, and the development part of the team. So for example, let's see, I want to share these slides online. It's difficult to write this story without some kind of file size included in that story. So a file size restriction may not materially change the size of the story. Okay, I'll throw an if statement in there, and we ought to test that. That still is one piece, one user story. There's a place where it gets too big, and you have to break it up, and that's a whole other part of the Agile art. It's a good question. So what do we mean by driven? Acceptance tests, at this point, it's kind of what we've always said, is you need to write the tests, and you need to understand what the tests are so that I can execute them at the end of the sprint. What are my tests? But the change here is that the tests should be driving the development. Not driving the testing period, but driving the development. So what do we mean by driving it? So if you have a driver, you don't get anywhere without the driver. We don't do development work until we have understood what the tests are. And even more precise than that, all the development work know what their test is. So you'll see this again as I talk about stand-up. We want our programming teammates to understand what is the test that you are working towards right now. Another way to say that is to build it in testable pieces. So if you have a problem in your sprint where, in a Scrum model, where the first 2 weeks are all programming and nothing is testable until the very end, and then it's crunch time for the QA part of the team, or everybody goes over to quality assurance, that problem is addressed by driving your development work with testing. And I'm going to expand on this in the next slide. But by saying, let's organize the work from the beginning into testable pieces. And that's what I mean by driving it. We don't leave without it. I've got more examples on that coming for us. Let me elaborate on what I mean by a testable piece. And these acceptance tests serve kind of two masters, or you might say there's two flavors of them. There's acceptance tests that allow a technical professional to agree that something has been finished. There's also the things that can roll up to those criteria that my product owner can understand. Both of those are valuable things to do. Both of those are problems that put us on that cost curve before. It's a reason to change the software. And our goal here is to execute those as soon as possible. So we want to build something in a slice that as soon as that slice is complete, we're able to deliver on it. Now the problem with this is programmers. The main character failing with programmers, and understand that I am one, the main problem with developers is that they like their job. If you give them an open-ended problem, they will sit in a room and write software until the food and Mountain Dew or water run out. So we have to constrain that from the beginning. And the way that they look at the world is in terms of the systems that they're familiar with. So if we hand a user story off, like the one we're talking about with a teacher, sharing slides online, they'll want to build it in terms of the layers that technology shows up. So the default for a lot of folks is to build the database first. You hear a lot of house stories like, I gotta build the foundation, and then we'll build the walls of whatever your middleware is, and then we'll build the roof that is the user interface. And then it's the third week of the sprint, and now it's finally testable, and we discover half of the database stuff doesn't make any sense because we've got something that we thought was a one-to-one relationship that is actually a many-to-many relationship, and we've just blown up a whole bunch of this work and pushed us up that cost curve. I'm fond of the metaphor that software development is exactly not like building a house, because things can be changed. I can build a tiny slice, and that's what we want to see here. A little bit of user interface, a little bit of middleware, and a little bit of database, so that I can test this pass through the system. So before I build out the rest of the system, I want to see it in a way that somebody can verify, ideally my product owner. This doesn't happen by accident. This is not going to be the habit of most of your teammates. In fact, it can't be. Even if you have somebody who's like, oh yeah, I went to the thing and I want to build vertical slices, you've got to start it from the tests. We've got to know what the tests are, what vertical slices do we want, and then move into this. And that gives the idea that where all this acceptance test-driven development is actually in planning. I wish that we had called this acceptance test-driven planning. This makes a certain amount of just intuitive sense that if you want your team to work differently, the team has to plan differently. And so if we want to plan differently, we have to have a different goal and different communication in the planning portion. In Scrum, this is your planning day. In Kanban, this would be your planning column. However you want to handle it, it's compatible with lots of different processes. So let's see a little bit of what that looks like. So we've got our user story, which is the one from before. And let's say the first test we're talking about here is to just upload a file and see confirmation. That's kind of the first thing that you need to do in the process. So the developers are automatically say, oh yes, we need to first do some database jargon, right? And some system jargon, and some front-end jargon, and we've got a jargon on the jargon. That's what planning feels like sometimes. And it's not like this test comes for free. There may be some work for the quality assurance folks as well. This is to generate some test files. If you want to upload something, what do you want to upload? It needs to be a legitimate file. There's some work for me there to have a few options. I may create a more detailed test plan than this. There's some work to be done to do this test, right? So we put those together. What you see here is one of my favorite tools for planning of a co-located team is just physical stuff. Lets the dev folks communicate about their jargon, but it also tells me, when I look at this, how much stuff do we have to get done before this is going to be ready. So we automatically have feedback to the team. If we say this is our first test, how many hours are in this work and this work? That's a good sense of how far down that timeline are we going to be. Is this small enough? Your team can have a goal. I can't give you a number, but I like to see things that are testable every day. I've seen everything from 4 hours to, oh my gosh, we got from a month to a week, and we thought that was amazing. Well, whatever your goal is, you can see what did we plan to do? How frequently did we plan something to be testable right here in this physical board? You'll see a little bit in the future of when you get to stand up or any kind of status. Stand up is a planning session, but if you want to know, I'm working on this work, generating these files so that we can do this test. What are the programming teammates doing? This also becomes a prioritization process. Because if you leave it to the developers, love them, what are the first tasks that developers do? How do they prioritize? What's that?
Easy.
Easiest? Coolest technology? Something like that is not to do with something else. And I can tell, even if I'm not deeply technical enough to understand what these tasks are, I know that these three things have to get done before this can be tested, and y'all aren't working on them, and I want to know why. That's something I can understand. We made this plan to unlock this one first. You're working on something else. Should I change to go along with you so that we understand we're all working together towards the same goal? You can have a little bit of fun with this. If you think of this as like an achievement, if you play video games, that sort of thing, and if you want to unlock that achievement and get that badge, then you want to do the least amount of work possible to unlock that badge. And that's the question we ask. And we enable our teammates to also challenge each other. Are any of these things not related to this test? So in a first habit, if you're just taking this on, we've got to create all the database tables. Are there any database tables you will neither read nor write to in the process of this test? Don't create them. Cut that stuff out. Move that on to a different test. Gets really exciting then as you continue this to say, well, what test will handle those? There wasn't one. Oh. Maybe we should not build that feature because we don't care about it, or that's a change we forgot to tell you about that you'll also need to test. Grab a sticky note and get that written down. Sometimes it goes the other way. What are the tasks for this test? And that's where you see developers who came with I created all my tests already because this meeting takes too long. It's said sometimes, right? And I said, okay, great. Let's just organize them test by test. What are your tasks for this test? Just a second. I'm going to build that thing that you're going to test. Now that you mention it, didn't think about that condition, and we get those understood from the beginning. Sometimes it goes the other way, which is you don't need to test that. Well, tell me why. Maybe it's who's working with folks that are writing unit level tests? This is a good conversation to say, is there a unit level test here that I should be reviewing so that I can not duplicate that effort here? How is this going to get tested? And have that conversation here in acceptance test driven planning. This is the big moment. If you have questions at this moment, I'm going to elaborate on what you can do with it, but this is kind of the culmination right here. I want to enable the skeptics to speak up. I like skeptics. I don't like deniers. Skeptics can get convinced with evidence. Deniers cannot. The other thing I like about this physical approach is I literally can't pick this up. It communicates. This is on top of it. You don't have to go to cards, but if you're using an online task system, well, who's using physical stuff today? You know what I'm saying? Do you like it? Do you hate it? Depends on the day of the week.
Ask those two guys.
They didn't raise their hand.
We like it.
Yeah. What for
It's
those?
tangible. They can see it.
Doesn't generate any burn downs though.
No.
Yeah, somebody's got to do that stuff. For those of you who are using electronic tools, what do you use?
Jira.
Jira. It's a Jira shop all around. Jira is a little trickier to show these dependencies. You can get there with subtasks. So you may choose to break your user story into tasks, and each task is a test, and each test has subtasks that are development and test tasks that will roll up to that in particular. This can be a big, long conversation the first time you do it, because you're going to discover that you have the two sides have two different ways to break down that problem. That is the work of acceptance test-driven development. Sometimes we'll say, well, I want to do this test. So for the For upload and C confirmation, we'll say, okay, we're gonna do that. And then we're gonna test that it's only these allowed file types, and that's a separate one. And then we're gonna test that the file is only this size or smaller. And the programming teammate is gonna say, you have broken it into pieces that are this big, and this big. So as long as that's clear, we're okay. Does that work together? And sometimes it doesn't even break down that way. You've broken it just on two completely different axes. The way that we may initially break it down into tests maybe is not deliverable in that way. I can't give it to you like that. I've got to give you this set of tests and then those set of tests. That's the communication. And that's why I say low tech. Because that has nothing to do with how to get Cucumber or RSpec working or how to do natural language parsing that everybody gets wrapped around the axle. That conversation about how are we going to organize our work together so that the work that the developer does lines up with the work that the quality assurance professional is doing, that's the heart of the system. If you've got that, then you have most.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Just to make sure I understand this. This would require the product manager or owner, the programmer, and the tester to all be in a room at the same time before development starts on something.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe product owner, maybe not. That's the person that could go first. Is if we discover we have questions for them, we'll make our guess at our assumption, and we write those down and check them later. That may just be a teaching moment that now we know exactly why you have to be in the room for this. But definitely programmers and QA folks together in the same room, absolutely, and that's where the magic happens.
It's not going to happen. With or without the requirements?
With. That's what you're basing it on, right?
It's the same model as acceptance test-driven development and developer test-driven development. It's still the basis of TDD. There's a good diagram out there that blend those two. And if you do acceptance test-driven development before coding or developer tests, it's the same principle.
And in fact, if you talk to, I lost his name, the father of TDD. Quiz time. It's not in my head now either. Anyway, somebody? No, I don't have it either. I can't come up with it. Sorry for that.
You don't mean part of XP though?
No. Anyway.
Is it Ward Cunningham?
No. It's the. Anyway, TDD was not originally even intended to be only at the unit test level. That was the easiest thing to teach, and that's what everybody got stuck to. And so you're spot on that this is how it was supposed to work from the beginning. That idea of let's break it down into tests and use those tests going forward. And if you can't get your developers to come in the room with you, you've got to sell the problem first. And so that's where you got to start from the beginning
And
of
it is
my
hard because that'll equate to
conversation.
longer story points, et cetera, but there's an end benefit into that.
And set up to, as you go to persuade those folks, start with horror stories. So the way that you persuade people is not with facts and data. Developers are not nearly so logical as they'd like to represent themselves. Just like everybody else, they're persuaded with anecdotes. Take something that happened in the last couple of months that was awful because you didn't talk. Say, you remember when you built that whole subsystem and then you gave it to me and we discovered that it wasn't even supposed to work in a web browser, it's supposed to be FTP, and we had to do all of that rework? You remember that? Let's not ever do that again. Or if it's a continual problem that you have of the crunch time at the end of the sprint where you have the handoff, related to stories in your environment, not hypothetical potential stuff, because it's easy to shoot holes in hypotheticals. Related to specific problems that you have that you don't want to have again. That's how to persuade. That's my psychology portion of the speech. So, but definitely, if you're going to do this, the two groups have to talk. That's kind of the entire point. What it helps you do, you can come into this, you can enable both sides to do prep. So I kind of mentioned that in passing, that the developers want to break it down, do an initial breakdown, and we'll do an initial test creation, and then we bring them together and change them, as long as you set expectations correctly that this is going to change, and in fact, the change is evidence of success. That's the way that I like to set that up, then that kind of thing can work, and it helps allay the like, oh, this is going to be a 4-hour meeting kind of concern. But set that up too, that when we get in there and we can't test it the way they deliver it, and they can't deliver it the way we wanted to test it, somebody needs to like jump out of the corner with those crackers and confetti and say, woohoo, right? This is why we wanted to get together, because we both had completely unworkable plans. So the fact that we're having this problem, that's evidence of success. The other thing on adoption that I want to give you is you don't have to do it for the whole sprint if you're in Scrum. You don't have to do it for every story in your Kanban backlog. Pick one and say, every other story in this sprint, we're going to do the old way, we're going to do ATD on just this one. And so that takes your planning session from 4 hours to 1. And you're going to learn to communicate with each other, and you'll get better at it. That lengthens out the amount of time it takes you to be ATD by the book. But I'm not the Pope of Agile, so I'm not going to excommunicate you from the church. So if that works for you and that helps people dip their toe in it, that's another good tip. Long sidebar there, but good question.
Kent Beck?
Yes. Thank
But
you.
you did mean XP.
Well, I guess so, but
That's where he documented it was as part of an XP practice.
Sure.
12.
I thought there was another thing that was a precursor to that. The software archaeology, I guess, doesn't matter so much. The idea it is consistent with that original one, which is one of the other great questions you can ask here in planning. Come on, you can stay with me. Which one are we going to do first? How do we prioritize the tests? How would you prioritize the tests? What are some of the prioritization strategies you can use?
The riskiest first?
Yeah. Riskiest? And that can have several angles, right? What kind of risk do we have? Tech risk? What other kinds of risk do we have?
Schedule risk.
Monitors.
Safety. That kind of.
Yeah, depending on that. You have regulatory. So this just risk conversation is a great one. You can also do the easiest. Let's just see something here. And build
Similar
on
to
it.
schedule, but if it's customer risk and the fact that from the backlog perspective, you already slipped it from last sprint into this one, that may be critical. Just that alone on a relationship might be something to keep with.
I was going to say, whichever test demonstrates the most common use as the first one. There's lots of exceptional, weird, and corner, etc. The first test should be actually showing it does what it's supposed to do.
A happy path.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. We did an implementation, it was kind of exciting, we had this conversation, and we discovered that all of the technology risk was in understanding what the business wanted in all of the validation and the exception cases. So for the first part of the sprint, all we wrote was validation. Is this field required, that field required, this field can't be? We're working with a government form and interpreting. It's like a 1-page form with a 20-page manual. Crazy. So we're doing this demo, and the product owner pulls in one of the other higher ups and says, hey, I want to show you what we built. Wow, that's great. What happens if you fill it all out correctly? Filled out correctly, and it says error, success not implemented. Because at the end of the day, it's just posting a form to some other service. And the team said there's no technology risk in doing that. We didn't focus on that. We didn't build that first. Getting all of these rules right about what form should not be posted, that's what's important. And the interesting thing about this conversation, it's all about risk and risk analysis, which is a classic quality assurance skill set that will not exist in the mind of our development partners. And so being able to get our input on not just what should we test, but our input on what order should we build it, that's powerful to the success of, and to the success of the team. We're able to find these problems in validation before we've built the thing that actually submits it, because we may want to submit it differently. We don't have to, and as we're testing all the validations, we don't have to test the success case again and again, because I haven't implemented that yet.
I guessed your project, healthcare exchange.
Nope.
No?
Good guess.
It's not more like taxes.
Employment verification. Fill out an I-9.
So
exciting
the
folks.
thing about the riskiest is sometimes most of the riskiest I can think of are the hardest technical things are like performance and scale, which you actually can't verify early on.
Well, we may not be able to do it immediately, but that leads to the conversation, if we can't do it now, when?
Right.
Is it gonna happen in this story? And not, it gets you out of the default of it's either first or last.
Right.
And is there a point where we have enough of the system built, and this is where we have to bring in those developers and their intuition and experience, where do we have enough of the system built that this would be a legitimate performance
And how can
test?
you build that soonest?
Exactly, exactly. And just that conversation brings, again, the two sides together, and we have a better plan as a result. Let's see what this looks like.
So what did the higher up think when the success case said error?
I mean, we said we haven't built that yet.
And they said, oh, that's good.
In this case, we worked with them a long time, so they kind of knew what to expect of us. We've had other folks who, and part of the finesse here, and I'm going to talk about it on this slide. So the question's so good, it's on the next slide. Well, let me. I'll plug it together here. So, what's this activity? Who can guess? Daily stand-up. That's right. So they're all standing up, and they all look really happy. So, if you've made this plan, your daily stand-up should be a planning process, right? Your daily planning session is here. So you're looking at the results of the plan, and the one thing that you can guarantee about a plan is that that is not how we will do it, right? We discover new risk. We have a reason to change the priority of the tests, which means it changes the work that quality assurance is doing to prepare to execute that test, along with the change in the strategy for the implementation side. So maybe remove risk. We make those changes, and we're having that conversation about it. We're able to have a smart conversation because we did this planning together. I don't know if I'm the quality assurance person. I don't know how you jargon the middleware jargon, but I know you're not working on it, and it says 8 hours, and I'm going to be ready before that. What should I do in the meantime becomes the conversation here. Or it can also, either from quality assurance, or if you're dealing with a team lead or a scrum master, can say, hey, Johnny, don't you think you should be working on the middleware? That looks like a thing that ought to be done, so that we can all stay on track. The other thing that this gives us is not only our fast feedback on the quality of the project, but as it was hinted and we're talking about here, is feedback from our product owner. One of the most frustrating things to do is a demo for the product owner where I just want to show you this one box on the screen or one behavior or one outcome, and they start asking 100 questions that I didn't even try to implement, the team didn't try to implement. And if you mishandle this, you get a situation where they think it's not built and it's terrible, and you're just frustrated from spending your time with them. Understand that this is what I call PWSD. It's post-waterfall stress disorder. In waterfall projects, when you get a demo, this is the bad news that you have to live with. Because in those big projects, it's been months and months of development, and we've moved so far up that cost curve that any changes are pretty close to impossible. And so when we give you a demo, this is just what you have to suck it up and deal with unless your stuff is really trivial. And in those projects, when people try to do intermediate demos, it's still after such a big chunk, or that system doesn't allow change, even if it's downstream of that, that this is the bad news you are going to have to live with. And from their point of view, I get the same outcome. If I don't go to those meetings, like if I go to those meetings, nothing changes. If I don't go to those meetings, nothing changes except I get an hour back in my life. So they're expecting that everything is getting done. If we get in front of those expectations by either including them in the planning session or just summarizing it, here are the chunks we're going to build this in, then we get in front of those expectations and we can have a short conversation. You remember that piece I told you we would build first? We just built it. I'm going to show it to you. And then when they're human beings and they forget that we were going to build other pieces later, they ask other questions. Especially if you do the demo near your board or it's electronic, you can refer to it. Your question is this test that we haven't built yet. Next question, that's this test that we haven't built yet. Next question, that's this test that we haven't built yet. And the awesome part to highlight in this process is when they do have a question about the stuff that you did build and it's a problem. And you found something and you have to change it. You bring in your team and you say, how long is it going to take to change? And When you've done this well, we've moved down that cost curve. There's going to be, what we're looking for is that time when your programming teammate says, oh, well, I just coded that yesterday. It's not a big deal to change. Somebody needs to say, woohoo! That's why we did this. That thing that just happened where you caught something and it was not a whole month of retesting or days or weeks or whatever your time scales are, that's the thing to celebrate and say, this was success. That's why we did this. Let's do more of that. You can track this as well, and if this is a metric you're having trouble with today, how frequently do we demo stories to product owners? This can be a great way to keep track of that. This is just a fun thing that I've built with teams where it's kind of like the inverse of days since work accident. You want this number to be really low. And as it increases, this is kind of a tacit check on how are we doing on achievement unlocked. Are we working on 5 achievements at the same time? That's probably not going to work super well. Let's get focused on just that one. This again requires your programmers and your quality assurance people to be together at the daily stand-up so they can check in with each other. But that's valuable because we want to check in with each other. We know why we're there, what we're talking about. It's not just another BS status meeting we have to stand around for. Well, if you're standing up, you got to be burning down, right? So Burnout Chart says a fun thing from our agile processes that we just stole from Waterfall. If you look in the PMP, most waterfall, like the guide to being a waterfall cop is the PMBOK, the Production Management Body of Knowledge. Burnout Charts are part of that as well. For those of you who are using Burnout Charts, what's on fire? What do you burn down? What do you measure? This is an axis of work to be done, again, over time. What do you guys measure now?
Tasks. Active bugs.
Number of tasks? Bugs? You start with bugs?
Well, that's the thing that we're focused on.
It's a metric.
Stories completed.
Stories completed is a good one.
Story points.
Story points remaining.
Impediments, maybe.
Impediments, which will kind of burn up and then down, right? Because it starts hopefully at 0 or number close to 0 in the beginning of planning. Let me start with story points, which is great if you've got a high functioning team that is able to do one story at a time. But for a lot of us, our story point burn down looks a lot like this. It's more like a bird across, right? And our ideal here is that it gets close to this line, which I've only ever seen once, and that team had some challenges on what truth was. So, and this is the point where the burnout is least useful. Like this is history, right? The burnout is supposed to be useful every day in the sprint so that we can change our behavior if something is going wrong. So, another thing that people burn out is tasks or task hours. And have you ever had your burn down that looks like this? We totally built stuff, and then we started to test it. It looks, whoops, we found a whole bunch of stuff right at the end of the sprint. And just because you did all the tasks doesn't mean it works. That's the problem with tasks. That's why people go to story points. But task is more granular, it gives you more feedback. These are both useful, and I work with a lot of teams that just use both of these so that you have some sense of it. But an exciting thing here, I bet you can see where this is going. Let's burn down acceptance tests that are completed. So how many tests do we plan to do at the beginning? It gives you this square module a little bit. And it might go up sometimes as we discover stuff. And this isn't a great outcome, but it's truth sometimes. We understand, are we going to make it? And in this diagram, we were never going to make it. We should have been having conversations to get below that line. That's what we want here. It changes our behavior. So we want out of that burnout chart. It tells us something that's actionable that we believe at least has a chance of being true. So while we weren't completing the story, are we driving the risk out of it? Are there things that are getting completed? How are we doing for time?
13 minutes,
13 minutes. Questions on the burn down?
Well, I guess that sounds good, but a lot of times you get requirements and then you start building right after that, right? So how are you going to know how many tests you have at that point?
Well, you just do ATD, so I don't know.
Yeah.
That sounds bad. Don't do that. And that's what you want to contrast it with, is we don't know how many tests we have. We don't know how much risk is left in the system. And that's what we're trying to address here. And some of the knobs that you turn on this process is just how granular do we get with the tests. And I think days is a pretty reasonable one to start with. Can we get something that is testable every day or two during the sprint? That keeps you from having a million tasks and a million tests that you can't keep in your mind, but something that people are able to summarize. And it also helps with that conversation about just how long is this planning session going to be? Question. Yeah, if you don't write acceptance tests, you can't bring them down, but that's the idea, is that we'll know what Other questions?
Do you have an average of time that you should be spending on planning if you were doing Scrum, let's say, for each sprint?
There's a lot of variables there. Obviously, whether your team has done it ever is one of those, but also how familiar the work is. So if the work is very familiar, you can get, and the longer your sprint is, the longer your planning is going to be necessarily. My ballpark figure is 10 to 15% of your time is probably spent in planning. That can be surprising for you if you are, if you have a 3-week sprint, it's 120 hours. 10% of that would be a day and a half. So it's a lot of planning when you think of it in hours, but if you think of it as a percentage, that I think helps put it in context. It gets easier the shorter your sprint gets. And that's why I like 1 and 2 week sprints, is because then it turns into something more like a couple of hours. I also stress that it's a working session, not a meeting. A meeting is deciding what we're gonna, deciding for somebody to go do some work, and a working session is doing the work, and planning is work, but that's just my soapbox.
Have you ever run across where this gets into some gray area? And by that I mean where the teams, or let's say the solution focus, isn't so product driven, but it's more solution driven. For instance, the same developers are part of a DevOps team that take in customer bugs, or you need to deliver build plus deployment and a desired state config, going forward. All of those pieces are part of definition of done, and by the way, you're going to get customer bugs fed back into you that you need to prioritize. There are some solutions, some software delivery life cycles that have to involve that. Does that change? Is there a twist you put on this saying let's account for that?
Well, the number one thing we want is visibility, right? The burnout doesn't solve any problems. It just shines a big spotlight on it.
Yeah.
So it makes you talk about it. And so the example you have is, we have a customer bug and it has to get fixed. We didn't know, and it has to go in now. The burn-down will tell you whether that's going to push stuff out and about how much it might push out, so that you can respond to that. And then over time with that, or if you size those at story points, it's kind of not ATD related, but if you size those bugs in story points, then you can get a rough estimate of maybe over a project what percentage is actually going to be taken for production bugs, and then you can track that against your project. That's just story planning.
And it maybe be metrics that over time say maybe you need to sequester a dedicated team for this if it's impacting velocity too much or whatever. All right.
Other questions? That's our low-tech approach to acceptance test-driven development. Our goal is fast feedback, and we start that in planning. We relate all of our development to a test. Some people would say you need to write the test first. I want to open the door a little bit to our programming teammates to do preparation if that makes them feel better. I think you'll get to a place where they say, just tell me what the tests are, we'll reorder the tests until it works, and then we'll make the development tasks. I think that's where people get, but you don't have to start there. You don't have to be super orthodox about that. But it's that fast feedback that's the goal. And then this is that fast feedback of the process, of the conversation, the way that people work together, is the gateway drug to automation. You've done this well when we say, oh, that test that you wrote at the beginning of the sprint, can you run that again? How soon can you run that again? I really wish these great tests that we're designing together and organizing the code towards could be just run all the time. Like, what if we had a button that did that? And then what if we got a drinky bird set up so it presses that button all the time? Yeah. Then, and only then, we're ready to go and automate and open up Cucumber, RSpec, and those kinds of things. But it's a tool that lets you use ATD, the process, the conversation, the planning strategy more effectively. If you jump into the tool, you don't do the rest of this stuff, it's just sort of technological and lazy.
What kind of percentage have you seen that where they do, they do jump into the tool first? And
90? I mean, I made that number up, but
Yeah.
that's what I see over and over again. I should say I have some selection bias. As a consultant, companies that do things really well and got it right on the first try don't hire me. So it's like, hey, we'd like to pay your consulting fee to tell you how awesome we are. I would like that too, so if anybody's in that boat, I'm for hire. Those are easy things. But that's the number one problem that I see. And as I read like online communities and stuff, and if you read some of the blogs that talk about, we used Cucumber and then we threw it out, we don't use it anymore because it wasn't delivering any value. Nobody was looking at the Cucumber tests. And that's what we're looking for. And if you, Cucumber, for those of you who may not be familiar, Cucumber is a tool that allows, whose proposition is that allows you to write what looks mostly like English in this format, very much like that user story format, but it's given when then, and those are the automated tests. The thing that I think it most obviously delivers on is that the tests, the automated tests, are readable by non-technical personnel. The question you've got to ask yourself if you're going to use that tool is, who's going to read them? Is there somebody who doesn't read code that's going to read those tests? Going through this on a low-tech process, who is it that I'm doing test review with? Do I have an audience for a tool like that? And then that can let you, if you have an audience for that, then that tool is going to be valuable to you. What I think a lot of people realize is that as many quality assurance professionals are given a lot of leeway, you should create all the tests that they need, and my product owner is not going to look at anything but like 2 or 3% of those tests. And the rest of it, it's on me as a professional to get done. That's a really common, and I think not a necessarily bad environment to be at. You may not have a lot of use for Cucumber in that environment. It's kind of neat that I can write my tests in English, but it would be a lot easier if I wrote them in Python, and all my programming teammates, they read Python just fine. So that tool may not be useful. Other tools, like RSpec or the RSpec approach, then may be more interesting to you because nobody wants to write the test in English. That's not going to happen. I listened to one guy talk about Cucumber, and he said, I want to show you a picture, and it slides up on the thing of the product owner that I worked with that actually wrote these tests, like typed in given when then, and it was usable, and I was able to execute their test in our system. And he switches the slides, and there's just 4 hooves at the top, like horse hooves. He said, well, it's a bad picture because they were flying away to their sky castle for the tea party with the tooth fairy. That never happened to me, he says. But his value that he was finding in the tool is it produced output that was readable. So it wasn't like they were going to write this themselves, but they wanted to know what did the tests cover, and that produced them readable output. And that's what drove him from Cucumber into RSpec. And again, that's by understanding what is the process we're going to use these for. That process, who are the people involved, and what are the conversations we need to have. Learn that before you learn your tool. And you may never get there. You may decide that this is valuable enough on its own, and the automation stuff. If you have other challenges, like environments that are difficult to set up, data that you have to get into place, COBOL that you still have to interact with that makes automation costs really high, ATD doesn't imply automation. It can still deliver a lot of value. That's my talk. More questions? I would be glad to hear. Is this going to work for you? What if you are somebody who thinks you can try it like next month? Tell us about it. Is that you?
I would just say that sign had on that thing that said it's been X days since the last part they were doing.
Yeah.
That is awesome. I wish I had that in my last place.
I'll loan you a sticky note. What else? Who's going to try it? Somebody going to try it?
Yeah, let's see if I can get my dev on the next major feature to do the tests up front.
Park, how many mats have you written this month?
This month?
We got 7,
Nicole.
8, 10.
Milestone acceptance test.
Oh, I just figured it was a guy.
We have several maths too. Yeah.
Trying to define those up front. That's the
Yeah.
goal of the sprint, to make sure they all pass.
Yeah. And if you discover things, I mean, you're gonna, all right? That's just the truth. And that's the exciting thing about software development, right? Is that we're doing things every day that no one has ever done before. That's what I love about this industry. Because if it's been done before, I will download it, license it, copy it, and I will not build it. I'll do other things. And it's not all curing cancer. Sometimes it's system A talks to system B over protocol C, and that's never been done before, but we still got to do it. So you're going to have discovery. But you can follow the same process. I discovered this test, or I discovered this work that has no test. All right, let's create that. Let's understand every work rolls up to a test, and when are we going to do it? We can do that as we go.
So, one of the barriers to entry into this, and I'll preface this with the fact that we are almost waterfall where I work. Not quite so bad, but one of the barriers to entry is the test team is always way far behind the developers, right? We're trying to test the stuff that they've already developed. We can't be writing the tests for them before they develop. In fact, they're developing before the requirements are even done. Any suggestions?
Well, you have to convince people that there's a problem. So back to Aristotle. Get everybody to agree that there's a problem. And do it without hinting that you have a solution, right? And this has been my role as a consultant a lot, is to just get people to talk about it. And eventually they come around to the idea that I have, but they think that it's theirs. That's great work. But if you can get everybody to agree that the problem is the cost increasing over time, and that's where I think you could start, is that because we tested here, and how long do the developers work on average on a unit before they give it to you?
It's not that well defined.
Fair enough. But if you pick a number that people are likely to agree with, like a month, is that?
Yeah.
And say, by default, we start with, if I find a bug, then it's something somebody did in the last month broke the system. And that's a big pool of people. And there's probably some horror story. And well, first, the way it usually works is, well, it's probably Keith's fault. I know your name, so I can pick on you here. And because Keith was working in that area, so we just blame Keith and we assigned the bug to Keith. And you've got to have some of these horror stories where Keith worked on it for 3 days before he discovered that it actually wasn't his fault. It was some unexpected implication from the work that Park did, and it took us 3 days to find it. And it's tempting to say, well, that's software development. Wear a helmet and get over it. But if we can move that cost curve down and go from something that the entire team did this month to something the entire team did this week, Keith's changes weren't in that week. It couldn't be Keith. And so we go from something that somebody did to Park. You're the only one that made changes in the last couple of days. It has to be your fault. And that's the kind of stuff we're looking for. If you can lead it, I want to write a Halloween post, lead it with horror stories. And say, this is the stuff that went terribly wrong, took forever to find. Remember that kind of stuff. Faster feedback will help. We don't need a new tool. You don't need to get an install and have some capital outlay. Just let's have this kind of conversation. And we could try it out on one story.
Well, that seems like too, maybe the start would be is just, your stand up and the developer says, I'm working on X, right? You can say, well, it seems to me, here's a test I want to run. That would be easy to do. I've never thought of doing it until now. Maybe that would be something you can try out.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I think along with your keep it personal and having the kind of the horror stories from the local things, you start with that and get everyone fired up, but then you're able to also, you just Google that child on the net and it's out there and it's got dollar values, and you obviously say, with some caveats, this is kind of just from the net, I don't exactly trust it, but $1 here, it's $10 here, all those kind of things, and it tells the message pretty well.
And a great thing when you have a process that seems to work for other people on the internet but doesn't work for you, or people are not willing to try because they're convinced that it won't work. The question I like to ask is, what's different about our company? This seems to work for other people. what is it that's different?
Well, we're different.
And you'll get two outcomes. One is you've shamed them and they tried anyway, but you get to focus the conversation on what's different about your company versus others. The ones that you have to be careful not to accept are, oh, but we work on really complicated problems. And one of my consultant friends, she has the best story for this. I'm so jealous. She was working with a financial institution who will remain unnamed. And they said, and she was talking about these kind of processes, and they said, well, but our problems are so complex. I'm not sure you can apply this here because they're so complicated. And she said, well, two things. I give you simple examples so you can understand it. If you take a martial arts class, I don't just punch you in the face until you figure it out. It's not a good way to teach, so I don't do that. The other one is, this process seemed to work for my client last month, who was NASA. And they seem to think it would work pretty well. And so, how is your organization different from rocket science? It worked for that. And that was a fun case. But that can be an illuminating question. And some of them are legitimate answers, like we have this ancient piece of technology. But that's what I like about the low-tech part, is that I'm not trying to embed some new tech. I'm not trying to ask somebody to learn a new programming language or framework. I just want to have a conversation about what we're building.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
So as tradition holds, then he has the honor of picking it's an entertainment book, this one.
All right. Andy Fukuyama?
Indeed.
There you go.
Yes.